So Cody Rhodes recently said that the Four Horsemen faction or something like it will happen in All Elite Wrestling. And on the Squared Circle Psychobabble, Ralph and I will try to predict who will be part of this four-person faction. Welcome everybody to Squared Circle Psychobabble. Ralph, interesting interview from Cody Rhodes last week with Talk Sport, and of course the conversation of all these teases with the Four Horsemen was brought up. Here's what Cody Rhodes had to say. No one has planted new Four Horsemen seeds, really. Maybe a few baby seeds have grown into this speculation about a four-person group, and then people have mentioned the Four Horsemen. I don't think you can ever do the Four Horsemen. That's ambitious, braggadocious, and very likely you'd have the most uphill battle ever. He went on to continue and say, I think in this case, I love flirting with some of the concepts that were out there because my dad and my family was always the antithesis of the Four Horsemen. Their biggest rival was my father, and now one of his biggest rivals is genuinely one of my closest confidants and coaches, and it's really a different career than I had envisioned. But I love having Double A there, and I know Arn has had some conversations with Tony Khan and FTR, and I know Shawn Spears has had some conversations with FTR. Rhodes would finish this off by saying, there's this kind of lingering situation here. But really, the only way you'd ever know if something like that would work is you got to get in there and touch one another and wrestle on the same team, maybe even against each other. That's really the only way to know. So I'm curious to see, like everybody, I'm curious to see where that goes. So he's definitely saying All Elite Wrestling's probably going to test this thing. So here's the question. Who do you think are going to be part of the four? Now, we talked about it before recording, and we agreed on two of those names of those four, and that is FTR. I think they're obviously the best bet because they remind you so much of Arn Anderson and Tully Blanchard. So they're an obvious one. And of course, they've been going on Twitter teasing with tweets with the Roman numeral 4. Obviously, we saw Dax Hardwood put up the four fingers on the last episode of AEW Dynamite. I think they're a shoo-in. If they ever do this Four Horsemen faction or something like it, they're part of it.
Yeah, if they're going to do something like the Four Horsemen, even if they're not going to call it the Four Horsemen, I think that FTR is definitely a team or two people that I definitely see within that group. Reason I say that is when you talk about the Four Horsemen, I think it really speaks to a specific demographic that AEW isn't necessarily trying to target right now, but if they decide to do a group like this, it will target that 50 plus audience that we talk about all the time, where NXT typically wins that demographic.
Mm-hmm.
The reason I think that having FTR within a group like that, that's going to really speak to the tradition of professional wrestling, or kind of call back to, the more the style that really kind of the older demographic is kind of accustomed to working, and the style that FTR prefers to work.
Right.
Because you have so much of that new blood or that new breed or that new approach to matches in AEW, and that's really what the fan base likes.
Mm-hmm.
Now, assuming that the fan base truly wants to see the car crash, as they refer to it, the car crash style tag match, or kind of the balls to the wall or all over the place, dives, flips, all that stuff. If that's what the fan base wants to see, and FTR is going to take a more classic kind of approach to their wrestling style, I think that can really dig at the fan base, and I think that could really get them some major heat, especially if they start to go out there and cut a ton of promos about, the tradition of professional wrestling, how the guys there don't necessarily work a specific style, and how they're going to try to bring back a specific style to the industry, and how they're successful, and all those types of things. So I think it's natural for them to get heat, and I could certainly see how tying that into the tradition of the Four Horsemen or that group can certainly work in their favor.
Not only that, you talk about the Four Horsemen and all of the titles that those guys have won throughout the history of the faction. Obviously, Ric Flair leading that with his, 16 world championships. You got Arn and Tully winning multiple tag team championships. So FTR, I would think, as long as they're full-time AEW, they're eventually going to get the tag team championships. Now, they might be the next ones to win the titles off of Hangman Page and Kenny Omega, which I think is going to happen. And that will just add to the fuel to the fire if they can be like what we saw with NXT in the Undisputed Era, where they all grab all the titles. That includes the TNT Championship, the tag titles, and the AEW Championship. So who are the two that take the TNT Championship and the AEW Championship. And for me, you don't even need someone to take the TNT Championship because he already has it. And that's why I think Cody Rhodes will be part of this. Obviously, you have Arn Anderson already tied into this, being his head coach and his manager. Tully has been at all of Cody Rhodes' matches. He's been watching FTR matches. So I think the dynamic of Arn and Tully being told throughout Dynamite obviously is hinting that Cody could be part of this as well. Saying this, behind the scenes that we're going to try and test it, but I'm telling you, I know he's saying that they never planted the seeds, but he made it so obvious when he cut that promo and threw up the four fingers. We've seen Tully throw up the four fingers. Dax Harwood throw up the four fingers. So it just seems logical now that Cody's going to be part of this, because I think Cody really loves factions, and one of his favorite factions is, in fact, the Four Horsemen, which is kind of ironic because Dusty was was the Four Horsemen's biggest rival. So be interesting to see that that comes into storyline too.
So I'm glad you brought up Dusty Rhodes, because I think that's going to be an important part of this, and especially for the way that I see all of this playing out. At least if I was somebody working within AEW, this is how I would book this, so to speak. So you bring up an interesting point about Dusty, and you also brought up the point that there have been certain guys who have indicated that they might be within the group. They might be interested in being in the group. Certain guys teasing that there is going to be some form of the Four Horsemen. They've teased it on social media, as you pointed out. Some people, whether it's been FTR, Tully, certain guys like that, throwing up the Four Horsemen sign. So I think that what is going to happen here, right? So if it were up to me, build it up for a couple of weeks. Now, I would have it where, with Tully specifically and Shawn Spears, so I would kind of build up the dynamic between those two eventually, where Tully says, look, Shawn, you haven't been living up to your end of the bargain. I'm going to have to let you go. I can't represent you anymore. So Shawn Spears, I don't see being a member of this faction of the Four Horsemen, or at least this version of it, whatever they decide to call it. So Shawn Spears is out of the picture for me. He's not going to be in the group.
I agree.
Cody continues to tease this. Arn Anderson and Cody come out with Tony Schiavone, and Tony Schiavone says to him, look, I know you have an important announcement. Are you going to address the rumors about the Four Horsemen, or the faction that still remains, that still needs whatever name they decide to call it, right? Almost teasing, like, yes, they're finally going to announce, and Cody specifically is going to announce that they're going to bring back the Four Horsemen.
Right.
Tully comes out, and he points out to Arn Anderson, look, Arn, I understand what you're trying to do here, but think back to history and remember that his father, Dusty, was one of our biggest rivals. I'm not going to sit here and allow you to create a group in our honor with a Rhodes that's going to be associated with this group, especially because of the history between the Four Horsemen, more specifically Ric Flair and Dusty. But what he does say is, I have found fitting individuals that can represent this group and represent the tradition of professional wrestling and the Four Horsemen properly. And then obviously those guys come out. Those four people that I would have, one being MJF, because when you think about the Four Horsemen and you think about the centerpiece, the diamond, as they refer to it, the guy that's got to run it, the guy that's got the gift of gab, that's got to be MJF, and that's got to be equivalent to Ric Flair. Right now, in terms of who they have, yes, Cody Rhodes can certainly cut promos, and he can certainly get heat as a heel, and he can get his point across to be sympathetic as a babyface. But really, I think the most successful version of the Four Horsemen is always when they were working as heels. There's nobody that is going to get more heat, in my opinion, especially being the leader of a faction like this, more so than MJF, especially when you consider the history between him and Cody that's already documented. The fact that he's going out there and saying things like he's constantly overlooked, he's not given opportunities. And guys like Moxley, he even said recently that he feels like there's been a paradigm shift within AEW, and guys like Moxley are holding him back. So I would have him essentially play the role as Ric Flair. He's the leader of the group. Tully is going to actually represent this group and not Arn Anderson. And then you have Wardlow, who is essentially going to be the muscle of the group, similar to Barry Windham, if you want to compare him to him, or even Arn Anderson himself as the enforcer. And then you have FTR. So my version of the group, you got MJF, who is essentially the equivalent to Ric Flair, at least in his ability to draw heat and to be the mouthpiece of the group. You have Wardlow, who's going to be the muscle of the group. And then you have FTR. And the whole dynamic of this group is to bring back the prestige of professional wrestling and the more traditional sense of what wrestling used to represent, so they can go against the new school or the new breed of professional wrestling. And, that obviously would be Cody Rhodes, the Elite, and all the other young guys there.
I went back and forth between Cody and MJF. I totally agree with what you're going with MJF. That is a terrific idea. I love it. But here's how I would do it. So you bring up bring back the tradition of professional wrestling and old school versus new school.
Yep.
Now, the leaders or the forefront of the new school wrestling, at least in All Elite Wrestling, is the Elite, Kenny Omega and the Young Bucks. Mm-hmm. Now, you already have the tie-in with FTR and the Young Bucks and that whole dynamic already. They're already telling the storyline with Kenny Omega. Now, imagine this. We all know that the Elite, when you think of the Elite, it's mainly Kenny and the Bucks. But Cody and Hangman Page are kind of associated, but they're still like outside looking in when it comes to the Elite. Think about that when they're forming this new faction. They want old school wrestling. Cody Rhodes wants old school wrestling. Hangman Page is kind of a throwback to old school wrestling with a little hint of new school wrestling in there. And of course, FTR is FTR. So what if you have Hangman Page turn on Kenny Omega, you have Cody Rhodes turn on the Elite, and they form this new Four Horsemen with FTR and Tully and Arn Anderson, and they're representing the old school versus new school kind of dynamic, the Elite versus old school. That's how I think it should go. And like you said with Wardlow as Barry Windham, I could totally see Hangman Page in that role of Barry Windham as well. Not exactly the huge height-wise, but he's got some muscle, and he could be that. He's not exactly a talker, but I think he could be that dynamic as well. So I would love to see it that way. And it becomes a faction warfare for years to come where you could have Hangman versus Kenny and Kenny versus Cody and the Bucks versus FTR. And you could do 3 ways with Cody and FTR versus Kenny and the Bucks. Or, you could do all these different dynamics, and it could really prolong at least a 1-year feud between the two that might culminate at Double or Nothing or All Out, or whatever it is. So that's what I would go with. And hopefully this does happen. Do you think it does happen? And how soon do you think it happens?
I definitely think it's something that they should do. I mean, assuming that this is something that they've been teasing for, probably the past month or so, and the type of reaction that it is getting, and I think that it could get going forward, I think it is something that they definitely should do. And I think even if they don't call it the Four Horsemen, I definitely think we're going to get a group of 4 guys that is going to end up being, a group that's going to feud with the Elite or the newer style, the young blood, the up and coming group, right? Mm-hmm. So I definitely think this is something that is going to happen one way or another, whether they call it the Four Horsemen or they decide to call it something else. But I do think we get some variation of this group. Yes.
Right. Now, they could use the name the Four Horsemen if they want, because I believe it's either Arn Anderson or Cody or Conrad Thompson. One of those 3 have the trademark for the Four Horsemen. I know Ric Flair gave his blessing to use the Four Horsemen name in AEW. Tully and Arn are obviously there. So they could use it in theory, but I think Cody is right. And if you name them the Four Horsemen, you're really putting them in an uphill battle to live on the legacy. And obviously they're going to be compared to Rick and Arn and Tully and Barry and Ole and every other horseman that has been in the group and all the different forms of the faction. So I would love to see it. I don't know if I would call them the Four Horsemen, though. I don't know what name I give them, though. That'd be interesting to see what people in the comment section think, what they think. But
yep, I think that it would be difficult for them to get the name the Four Horsemen over, especially because, like you said, when you think of the Four Horsemen, you're talking about some of the greatest to ever wrestle.
Yeah,
you got Ric Flair, so living up to that expectation for either MJF or even Cody Rhodes would be a difficult task at hand. Even all the other members of the group. And I know the group has had so many different variations from, when it first started through WCW and all that type of stuff. So it would be difficult. I think that people would be open-minded with it more so if it was Cody Rhodes, because he does have that last name. And, given the lineage and association throughout the history of professional wrestling. So people might be more open to that, especially of the older demographic, because like you pointed out, people are naturally going to do the comparison. Oh, well, this guy isn't necessarily Ric Flair. How could they do this? So you might push some people away, but people might embrace it, and you never know. I just know that if they did something like this, it would certainly set the wrestling world abuzz, and people would be interested in it, at least just to kind of tune in to see what it was all about. So I think they should do it.
Yeah, I totally agree. Let us know if you guys think they should do it, who you'd have in your Four Horsemen in AEW. And don't forget to share us all over social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at SCPB Podcast. And for news, reviews, and conversations on all things pro wrestling, subscribe. Hit that bell for notifications. For Ralph Valenti, my name is Michael Valenti. Thank you for watching the Squared Circle Psychobabble.